Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Visible Workplace podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Rolley, and I'm joined today with a special guest and excited to see where today's podcast goes. His name is Jeff Standridge, and he helps organizations and their leaders generate sustained results in areas of innovation, strategy, profit growth, organizational transformation, and leadership. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here. I'm honored, and I appreciate the opportunity.
And I'm excited. What drew me to you was you have a past history in medicine, as I do as well, or mine's current as well as doing magic boards. But
Yep.
just let's begin with a little bit of an exploration of what was this? Are you doing any medicine at the moment? And if not, what did that used to look like?
Yeah. So the only thing I do at the moment is I consult with a number of healthcare organizations, and I sit on the board as a board of director member for an acute care health system. So I started out. I grew up in a very rural part of the South in the U.S. So South Central U.S. Very rural farming community in Arkansas. About 1,200 people in my hometown. And went off to university straight out of high school, about 2 hours away in the city that I live now, and struggled a bit academically and needed to work full time to pay my way. So I became an emergency medical technician, ultimately a paramedic, and then ultimately a respiratory therapist. So I spent about 9 years after I graduated college. I spent 9 years on a helicopter team for one of the largest top 5 pediatric facilities in the United States. It's called Arkansas Children's Hospital. So I spent 9 years as a medical crew member there, 6 of which I was also a professor at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences. So I taught pharmacology, cardiopulmonary anatomy and physiology. I taught neonatal pediatric intensive care. And I was noticing that a lot of our students were graduating. And well, the first thing that I noticed is that academic performance didn't correlate with success in life. And that really got me thinking.
So I could be passing school doing really well, and then suddenly into life, and it's falling apart.
So exactly that. So I could have straight A's, as we would call it here in the U.S. grading system, and not be able to hold a job, or I could have someone that barely graduated with a C, and they're still in the profession 30 years later and doing great, right? And so I developed an academic interest in what is it that differentiates top performers from average performers. Decided to get a doctorate in leadership versus another clinical degree. And so my doctoral dissertation was studying the differences between top performers in the healthcare world and average performers. And in no way did it correlate with academic attainment, credentials, certifications, letters behind one's name. It really all had to do with behavior, how someone consistently behaves and the competencies that they demonstrate on a day-to-day basis. And those competencies could really be divided in half: the competencies that give me the ability to generate consistent results, coupled with the competencies that give me the ability to generate long-lasting results in relationships. And so that then led me to a publicly traded company, a technology company that was in the data management, data analytics space. And they wanted to replicate that research for their software developers, database administrators, and wanted to identify what are the observable behaviors that differentiate high performers in our organization, and can we identify those and then use those to build competency models that we then use to select employees, coach employees, promote employees, evaluate employees, and et cetera. And so I spent about 18 months doing that in that publicly traded company.
Okay. And did you? All right. So we've already covered a bunch of stuff here that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Can we loop back to the idea of the straight A student and
Uh-huh.
the student
Uh-huh.
just scratching by on C's, and yet when we get out in the world, that those people were
Mhm.
not necessarily correlated at all.
Yep.
Did you see any straight A people that could do life well?
Oh,
And did you
sure.
see any C's that didn't do life
Yeah,
well?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that was
Cool.
that
So
was the
yeah.
critical point, is there was no correlation either way, right?
Okay. So it didn't
That
really
that
matter whether I got A's or C's to the outcomes that I actually got in life.
that's right.
And then that's where you became interested in. That was the dissertation.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you found that it was
It was
behaviors
behaviors. That's right.
rather than, so I can study, I can prove myself to be highly effective at studying, regurgitate the
Mhm.
knowledge, or even
Mhm.
answer the questions correctly, even if it's not a direct memorization experience. And yet that does not set me up for life and getting great results in life.
Yeah, exactly. And I even had an example in my own life. So when I came to university, I came as an undeclared major. So I had not picked a major yet. And I thought I wanted to be a finance and economics major because I had a family member who owned a bank down in Southwest Arkansas, and he encouraged me to look at finance and maybe come back down there and be a banker. And I took an introduction to finance and economics my very first semester, and I made the only D I've ever made in my life.
Okay.
Now, fast forward 40 years, I've never had another business course, yet I teach entrepreneurial finance to graduate students in the same college where the only grade I ever received was a D.
What do you make of this? I mean, what's your
Well, that I that
interpretation
I'm
of this?
I'm one of those prototypical examples of maybe I didn't have the academic background, but I had the intelligence. Maybe I had the ability to generate results and relationships over the course of a career. I did have those innate capabilities for finance. I lead 3 venture funds right now, right? So I did have the innate capabilities. I just wasn't prepared for college.
Aha, aha. Yeah, right. So again, it was a behavioral experience of not being prepared for college that
Mhm.
gave you the D rather than a competency around finance or not.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So these behaviors, so you said consistent results and the ability to have relationships with people. Was that the two defining factors?
Yeah, those were that'd be kind of the high level category, right?
Mm-hmm.
So within those the results domain, if you will, there are problem solving competencies, there are planning disciplines, critical thinking disciplines as well, how we manage projects, how we manage priorities, how we solve problems, how we overcome obstacles in order to get to the results, how we plan for those results so that we're planning for the right results. If you shift over to the relationships domain, things like building and maintaining trust-based relationships, empowering communication, teamwork, uh, uh, dependability, those kinds of things. And it's
Interesting.
not
Yeah.
unlike if you're familiar with Stephen Covey, who
Okay.
wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Well, it was almost a replicated finding from his research where he said you have the personal victory and then you have the public victory. So the personal victory being more results oriented, the public victory being more relationships oriented among his 7 habits. His son, Stephen M.R. Covey, wrote The Speed of Trust. He called it character and competence, character being the relationship kinds of elements, and competence being the more results driven elements. And so I've started most recently referring to it as grit and grace. Uh,
Grit and
grit,
grace. Oh, I
grit
like
and
it.
grace. So grit being those elements that lead to the grittiness, resilience, the fortitude to continue, the perseverance to be able to deliver results, and the grace being that which endears me to others.
Mm-mm. I like it. But we're seeing a repeating theme here. I actually thought those two books were written by the same gentleman. But they're written by his son. The second
Yeah,
one was written by his son.
interestingly,
Yeah, right. Interesting.
interestingly, if you read the first book by Stephen Covey, The Seven Habits, he tells the story of his son that he gives him instructions to go out and mow the grass, and he wants it to be green and clean, right? Well, it is that son that is Stephen M.R. Covey that wrote The Speed of Trust, 30 years later.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Fantastic. All right. And then, so we've seen results in relationships, competence, and what was the second, Mr. Covey's competence and capacity? No,
Character and competence. Yeah.
character and competence, and then through to your take on it, grit and grace. I like it. I like it a lot. This is and so was it obvious? Like, how did you work this out? Were these behavioral studies, or did you interview people? Just curious how you found it.
So I really kind of perfected the approach when I replicated the research at Axiom. And so what we did there is, so this company was a company of about 4,000 employees at the time. And I had all of the managers in the company and all of the employees in the company nominate top performers. And so the real interesting initial finding was that 80% of those lists were not duplicative.
Very interesting. Okay.
So think about that for a moment, right?
Yes.
How employees define top performance and how management defines top performance, 80% of the time were different. So we looked at those folks that really kind of crossed over on both lists, and we did a little more work with them, and we segmented out about 35 of those. And I hired a couple of behavioral psychologists to work with me. And we started by doing more qualitative historical methods kind of interviews. So tell me about a time when you were at Axiom, the company's named Axiom, ACXIOM. You were at Axiom, you were challenged beyond measure, you were staring failure in the face, yet you ended up being successful. Tell me what the situation was. Tell me with whom you were involved. Tell me what you thought, what you felt, what you said, what you did. And we generated around 150 success stories from those 35 or 40 subjects, if you will. And we then began kind of doing some analysis of those behaviors when we did the qualitative analysis of the recurring behaviors. And then we used a panel of experts to help winnow those down and do some factor analysis and put those into the competency. So we identified 8 competency categories, each competency having 3 or 4 observable behaviors. So I think we ended up with about 30 observable behaviors that we called them the Axiom 8. And those became then the basis for the competency models that we re-engineered the entire employee life cycle with.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So just to recap, so we've got a business of 4,000 people. You ask the managers and the employees for top performers. They're wildly different, but identifying a Venn diagram of the 35 out of 4,000 that show up in both lists, and then speaking to them about challenging and difficult stories or experiences that they had. And so maybe 3 or 4 each, we get 150 stories, then going through and pulling out the 8 behaviors.
So we pull it when we first analyzed, we had some 300 behaviors.
Wow.
Well,
okay, that's
then
a
when
lot.
we started, then when we started really analyzing those behaviors and realizing that some of them were duplicative, we had coded them this way, but those were really kind of overlapping behaviors, and so we had to go through a naming schema to begin naming the behaviors and aggregating them, if you will, and to remove duplicates, remove redundancies. When it was all said and done, we ended up then with 30 to 35 behaviors.
Okay. And then from there, bringing it down to the 8?
Actually, there were 8 competencies.
Oh, 8 competencies.
Each competency had 3 or 4 behaviors, observable behaviors that were part. So one competency perhaps was teaming and relationship management, and there were 3 or 4 behaviors that were observable behaviors that made up teaming and relationship management. Another behavior was results and achievement, or another competency was results and achievement orientation. And so there were several behaviors that you could observe that would tell you that someone was had a results and achievement orientation.
All right, so now what happens? I'm very curious. Having gone through this, we've identified the 32 to 35 optimal behaviors. Did you then go back to the rest of the team at Axiom and say, "Hey, do more of this," or how did that play out?
So it's interesting. They when they learned about my research, they offered me a position with the company, and I said, look, I'm happy as a professor in the medical field. I don't really know much about business, and they said, well, will you consult with us? And so at that time, technology company, all of their employee evaluation mechanisms were based upon skills, hard technical skills. And the challenge they were experiencing that led them to me was by the time they would get a skill block created for a particular job, half of it would be obsolete because of the half-life of, we say the half-life of medical knowledge is 5 years. Well, it was about 12 and a half to 14 months for IT knowledge, right?
Yep.
And so they wanted something that was more stable. So they hired me as a consultant. At the end of the semester, they offered me a full-time job again, and so I ended up staying with them. So now I'm in the company as an executive leading an enterprise-wide project to re-engineer the entire employee life cycle. And so now we have these sets of competencies that are standard and consistent across every employee in the company, independent of job role, independent of career level, leadership level, all the way up to the CEO. So the first thing that we did is we built an evaluation mechanism where the employee evaluates him or herself against these behaviors. He or she identifies a panel of peers and colleagues that also evaluate them, and then their direct leader evaluates them. So we have kind of 3 data points. I evaluate myself, an average of 3 to 5 people who evaluate me, and then my leader evaluates me. Drives really, really good dialogue about, how I view myself versus how other people view me.
Yeah,
And so,
I imagine in that experience that both the person that underestimates their skill sets as well as the person that overestimates their skill sets both have an experience of like, oh,
yeah,
okay, this is
yeah,
I thought I was here, but in fact I'm there,
that's
or I
right.
thought I was here and in fact I'm there.
That's right.
So yeah, very, very probably confronting from both of those experiences.
And it is from both. It's much more damning, if you will, when you have someone who's a senior executive who evaluates them straight across the board as top notch in every way, and the rest of the world doesn't see them that way. So,
That particularly in that elevated leadership position is
yeah,
that one is a
yeah.
humbling experience, I would imagine. It's like,
Yeah.
oh,
So
actually,
over the course of time, we started by building out the evaluation mechanism. Then that became part of the annual review process. Then we started creating interview questions to be able to allow us to interview for some of these competencies to better select people. Then we started building them into our just professional development. We started building them into our leadership development. We started using them to interview and promote leaders. And so it really became part of the entire talent management life cycle, so to speak.
and what happened for the business? Like, what was the overall outcomes? Did we see increased profitability? Did we see increased team happiness?
Yeah.
Did
So
you have results on
I,
that?
I got promoted, and I didn't get the opportunity to go back and do the correlation research between before we were doing it and after we were doing it. So I spent 20 years with the company, interestingly. And by the way, those competencies stayed part of that employee life cycle for about 18 of those years. But I ended up getting into mergers and acquisitions and starting companies for Axiom, and moved to the UK for 18 months and acquired 21 companies in 7 countries, and then started a company in Poland, started one in China, acquired one in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, did one in Brazil, Latin America. And so that's how I started the evolution. So I evolved from healthcare to a corporate consultant to then an M&A executive to now an entrepreneur, venture capital investor, and consultant. And so,
That's quite a journey there. That next bit, I figured you were still doing the work with Axiom, but to go to M&A and venture
yeah.
capital out of
Yeah.
that, that's just run me through how that appeared in your life. I'm curious.
Well, so the about 5 years after I started at Axiom, I was kind of an internal organizational development executive there, and the the company made a decision to buy a couple of parent companies based in Europe. One based in Teddington in the UK, and one based in Teddington's in Surrey, but kind of on the Middlesex Surrey line, and then the other one was based in the Netherlands, but with locations. Both had locations. They were competitors. Both had locations all around Europe, 7 countries, and so my leader saw something in me and said, "I want you to go there. I want you to set up the international HR organization. I want you to run due diligence on the acquisitions, and I want you to do all the integration." And so that's how I started. And then another thing unfolded. I was kind of a utility player, and so they would say, "Put Standridge in, let him figure it out," because I was very inquisitive, and I couldn't let a problem sit without figuring out some kind of a solution. I was kind of a corporate change agent, if you will. And so when we were having a hard time putting people offshore in India because of some of the privacy issues and what have you, I had 34 developers sitting in Warsaw doing work for me in the UK. And our CEO said, how did you do that? I've been trying this for 5 years. So he then asked me to start a company in Poland to create a global service center, and then asked me to do the same thing in China. And it just kind of evolved over the course of that next 10 years or so.
So I mean, the strategic advantage that to me that appears that you have is that you're masterful at these behaviors. That through the original health study, then into Axiom, and then seeing all these behaviors, presumably you literally know them like the back of your hand. And then when taken to these new experiences, the foundation that you're building across is this knowledge of the behaviors that work. Would
You
that
know,
be reasonable?
it is reasonable. I haven't really thought of it that way because I also have trouble with some of those behaviors occasionally. Like, I'm a results guy, right? But I think what that research did was it sensitized me to the fact that I was really, really strong on the result side. And sometimes in the pursuit of results, I could challenge relationships. It sensitized me to that. So I built a support network around me of people that I hired whom I knew were strong on the relationship side, and gave them permission to hold me accountable and give me feedback. And so it required me to be vulnerable. But had I not gone through that exercise and that research, I probably would not have been as sensitive to those differences.
Kind of be blind to the fact that you thought perhaps I'm getting the results, I'm getting the
Yeah,
results, we're doing so well, and oblivious to the fact that the relationships are suffering, and they're like, yeah, we don't really like working with Jeff.
exactly. And even though I was sensitized to that, I mean, there were still times where I stepped in it, so to speak, right? I would damage some relationships, and I would have to have somebody come around and say, "Hey, you broke some glass over here. You need to go sweep that up."
And that, I presume learning experiences. I mean, I don't think human beings are perfect.
Yeah.
I'm not perfect. I mess
No,
up quite a
absolutely.
lot, make some mistakes.
Sure.
But okay, right. So not perfect in the behaviors, but being able to see them, being able
Mhm.
to look at them, and then challenge yourself as, where am I strong? Where can I do? Where can I have more awareness around what's going on? And then I really like the idea of setting up the support people, because to get that vision of what am I not seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
it was instrumental. There were several people, even to this day, that and the company had a really interesting culture as well. I mean, it was really a culture forward type of company. They really tried to create an associate centered culture even back in the 90s. I mean, we had our first work at home policy in the late 90s, and
And this
way
is
before.
Axiom.
It was Axiom. Yes,
I mean
that's correct.
that sounds very yeah. I was still relatively young at that time, so I'm not sure what was going on. But it does sound like work from home back in the 90s was pretty. That's seems like a relatively unusual concept for
It was.
businesses at that
It was.
point.
And
Yeah.
you had to earn the right. You couldn't just request it. You had to earn the right by being a top level employee. You could request it, but it was subject to the approval of your leader. And oh, by the way, if you demonstrated that you were not able to perform as well in that environment, you could be brought back in, and there was an agreement you had to sign. And but it was work at home. I mean, it was hybrid work when hybrid wasn't cool or before it even existed.
I mean, that's very cool that you got to be
Mhm.
part of this.
Yeah.
Let's pivot a little bit
Okay.
and take some of your wisdom and experience here for entrepreneurs and
Mm.
business owners that are listening to the podcast now. We've spoken of these behaviors, the Axiom 8, the 32 to 35. What advice would you have? Like, what have you seen particularly that works? Perhaps for two different people that are coming to mind. One is I'm doing well, things are rolling well, I'm doing great, and I want to double down and be confident that I can hit my whatever that next level is. And
Mhm.
then secondly, for someone who's struggling, someone who's like, I've done this, I've taken this course, and nothing seems to be working, and I'm being challenged in can I continue? So probably more around the grit for the second one.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it sounds like the first one might be around grace, but
Yeah.
what would you say to these two? Do you have a preference to begin with one of them or the other, or
No, no.
take
I
them
mean,
both
I
at
think I would
once?
say I think I would say the same thing to each of them.
Yep, great.
Is first and foremost, there are really four ways that we develop, and the least effective of which is we take a training course, right? We just go and we sit in front of a talking head, and we take notes and we listen to them, and we might get the opportunity to interact, and it's necessary in some instances, but it is the least effective. Then there's self-development, where we truly have a motivation to learn and close a skills gap or a knowledge gap that we have. And so we go and we do that self-learning and self-development ourselves. Then there's relationships, right? We go seek out relationships with other people, mentoring. I think we spend far too much time as organizations trying to create a mentoring program and match seasoned leaders with young people. But what if they don't get on together, right? And that happens. So I think we're much, much better ahead to teach younger employees how to find and utilize mentors. And oh, by the way, it probably doesn't even involve asking the question, "Would you be my mentor?" Right?
Yeah.
It's hey, I've noticed some things about myself. I've gotten some feedback about myself. I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee and pick your brain and ask you a few questions, right? So relationships are the third way. And then the fourth way is experiences, being put in experiences. So when I went to the UK to run the due diligence on those 21 companies in 7 countries while also creating an international HR organization, I was 5 years out from being a respiratory therapist teaching at a medical school, right? I had no idea. But my leader saw something in me, and she put me in that experience, and it transformed my life. I mean, literally transformed my life
It
because I
sounds like
didn't
a
know what I didn't know in that regard.
yeah, sounds like a true sink or swim situation.
It was.
And somehow and just back to self, or I suppose what was going through your head at that time, or maybe not just head but heart, gut. Did you wake up one morning in a cold sweat and go, "Wow, I am way out of my depth here," or was there an innate trust, or how did that play out for you?
So I had experienced it 5 years before when I made the leap from academic healthcare to Axiom. And, I was at the largest health center in Arkansas as a professor, and I was around some of the smartest people in the world, I thought. And they were very smart. But then when I got to Axiom, it was smart people plus pace, right? Faster pace. And so the first 6 months I was there, I couldn't drag myself out of bed before about 7 in the morning, and I couldn't stay awake past about 8 because I was emotionally both exhilarated and exhausted, right? And so I had experienced that being thrown in the deep end. And this was just the second iteration of that 5 years later, going to Europe, because I was moving my family. My daughters were 9 and 11 at the time. And I don't know if I had the time to really get frightened. And I'm usually not frightful. I don't usually get frightened. But I remember not cold sweat, but I remember thinking, God, how am I going to do this? But again, leveraged the people around me and some of the folks on the ground there, made sure I hired the right people and invited the wrong people to work somewhere else and
To get off the bus, as it were.
right.
It's yeah, I mean, just coming back to those four methods of development: the training course, the self-development, relationship mentoring, and experiences. I mean, one obvious thing that strikes me is that entrepreneurs and business owners are having an experience. They're
right.
in it. They are dealing with whatever they're dealing with, whether it's working, whether it's not, whether the team's falling apart, whether the team's exceptional. They're all having an experience, and that would be the highest level of development. And I mean, I have seen that. My take on is that at least from a spiritual perspective, running a business is a wonderful spiritual development experience because it
really
shows where I'm not. It's like, oh, wow, that just burnt down. How do I respond to those things? But the training course itself, coming back to the first level, is there's information there, but assimilation, recall, all are relatively poor in my experience. We recently had to go through accreditation for cardiac arrest. And during the experience, I mean, it wasn't quite a true training course, sit there and absorb knowledge, but there were certainly elements of that. It seemed like it was okay. And yet, I'm sure if we called a cardiac arrest today at the practice, then there's got to be the full, whoa, hang on, I haven't dealt with this for 4 months now.
Yeah.
And I remember number one is like, get the card. And so we practice, get the card. Oh, there are all the steps. And now I'm familiar with it. But the actual ability, given our overload of information these days, I mean, there's just a vast amount of information that is very difficult to sit there and take notes.
Yeah. So I just, 3 years ago, a little less than 3 years ago, I stared flying.
Oh, wow. Like your own plane or like learning to fly? Yes.
Yep. And so I got my private pilot, I got my instrument rating, and I got my multi-engine rating. And I'll be 58 years old in November. I don't learn and absorb things cognitively as rapidly and process them as rapidly as I did, so it was probably one of the most challenging things that I've gone through in a long time because my brain doesn't absorb it. But when we're going back to those four types of learning, it really takes all of them, right? It is a continuum, but you can get the greatest degree of effectiveness if you're going back and forth on that continuum in order to close those gaps, right? So a little bit of experience, a little bit of relationship, a little bit of occasionally we've got to do that didactic, that lecture, coursework, which I had to do with my written exam, private pilot, but then I had to get in the plane and actually start manipulating the controls as well. So
I really like that assimilation of all four of those: the training course, the self-development, the relationship mentoring, and the experience. That instead of being separated, if I'm taking in all of those, then that is going to be a maximal learning experience and presumably better results on the other side of that. If I'm learning that way.
For sure. And I think everyone, and even another thing that we did back in the 90s and early 2000s was we had every employee in the company create a development plan. And it was like, okay, you've gotten the feedback on your competencies. Now you go put together a development plan and then you bring it to me. Once I see how you acknowledge your weaknesses and build a plan to close the gaps on those, I'm going to then give you some feedback and say, yeah, in addition to that, you need to do this and this. And then we're going to walk out of there with a plan and you're going to focus on those development areas that year, so to speak. And we're going to do the same thing next year. And we, you back to what I would tell those employees or those two people on the results and relationships side that you mentioned a few moments ago was to do just that, to get feedback, to assess where you're really weak, be willing to confront the brutal facts when you hear themes from multiple people that you're not strong in relationship management when the pressure's on, or that you struggle to consistently deliver results. Be willing to take that on board, and then build a development plan to close those gaps, and then run it by someone who can give you feedback on the development plan.
It's very interesting. What's coming up for me around this is that in Australia we've had new continuing professional development rules come in, or I think it's called CME, continuing medical education, and there's been quite a bit of kickback that the feeling is that it's relatively purposeless, that we just have it's 50 hours per year.
Yeah.
But when it's framed within an experience of, okay, I'm going to set my development, but then also get feedback around it, and then build the plan, then it seems to me that I am benefiting far more than just completing the hours or ticking the boxes. Instead, I'm becoming a better human being, hopefully a better doctor, whatever. But it is interesting to me that there is a lot of kickback, because I don't think we have built in any requirement for external feedback or for setting targets. It sort of is there, but there's a lot assumed of doctors that we just know what to do because we're doctors.
Well, yeah. So much of the global education system is teacher-centered versus learner-centered. And I teach a graduate course at the University of Central Arkansas in entrepreneurial finance, and my students have to negotiate a learning contract with me. So the first week of class, I tell them that they've invested $1,200 in this course. They need to get $10,000 worth of value in the next 7 years for it to have been a good return on their investment. So here's the draft contract for the grade of A, draft contract for the grade of B, draft contract for the grade of C. Take this contract home, mark it up, create a personalized learning experience around entrepreneurial finance that helps you. Here are some examples of things you might want to consider substituting, but you can really substitute anything. And then turn it back into me. I'll accept some of your negotiations. I'll decline and counter offer some others. And within 2 weeks, we'll have a contract between you and I, and that contract will go in your file. And at the end of the semester, if you do everything that you said you're going to do, then you're going to get an A. If you don't, you're going to fail. And
I mean,
and then you can renegotiate throughout the semester.
Well, they're far more invested in that experience rather than being told what to do. And that, I mean, my kids, I got two in high school at the moment, and it does seem that we have significant problems with motivation or with investment into education. But this could be one of the core problems. That the kids are like, hey, I'm just getting told what to do, and I'm not really trusting perhaps that all of this information that I'm being forced to learn is that useful. I do think that we see that, though they see it. They're like, I've asked around a couple of parents and they're not using their high-level mathematics that much outside of perhaps engineering.
That's right.
And yet you guys are all saying that this is the most important. And therefore, I think it's maybe these models need to change within the education system across the board.
No, I agree. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see that in the U.S. today. If the secondary schools, if the colleges and universities, if the technical schools, if they're not preparing people for the workforce, then what are they really doing? Right. And that's a debate among education purists, that education is about self-actualization and enlightenment. And I can't argue with the fact that my family tree was altered forever because of the education that I've received. But it was pig-headed determination that got me through that, because I crammed a 4-year degree into almost 6 years for my first degree. And
wait, you took longer? You took it.
Yeah.
Did you say 4-year degree into 6 years?
Yeah, exactly. I crammed it in there. Because it was hard for me, and what I spend a lot of time today talking to parents and others that number one, university's not for everyone. I've got a nephew who's in an electrical apprenticeship program right now. He just graduated high school and he's in an electrical apprenticeship program. Another one who's in an HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning apprenticeship program. I've got another one who went to college, right? And she's doing great. Um, Entrepreneurship is a viable career path with and without college. It can be a viable career path with college. It can be a viable career path for someone who would struggle in college. And so I just think we have a branding problem in the United States. It's getting better, but up until the last 5 years, every parent, every teacher thought every child should go to a 4-year institution straight out of high school, and they rack up massive amounts of debt and then drop out after 2 years. And they have nothing to show for it except a big debt.
A large
right?
debt. Yeah. I've seen this with two friends that returned. One returned later to school at, I think he was around 28. And just the investment and the passion and the driving force for why he was there was just so much clearer, extracted vastly more out of that course than perhaps the first degree. And then secondly, another friend who had been in teaching, in secondary school teaching here, and went back to medicine at 33 with 3 young children, quite a difficult financial experience, and yet his investment in that learning experience again was vastly higher. And so to ask, I'm looking at my youngest is in, well, my eldest is in year 11, so another year and a half and he's out. And I'm like, if you don't know what to do at university, maybe this is not the right choice right now. And I'm okay for him to come back at 23, 27,
Absolutely.
30. And it may never happen, but if there is a passion there for something that the university offers, then I think the level of maturity is higher. However, on the other side, there is that pathway of going through with the other kids doing it at the same time. So
Sure.
but it doesn't. I don't like what you bring up before of like most people expecting the vast majority of kids to go and do this when they don't know why they're there. That perhaps is false thinking.
It really is.
Belief
And
system.
I tell people I didn't even really become a good student until my second senior year. And they say, wait a minute, you had 2 senior years, and or I tell them, I had 2.5 actually, but yeah, I mean that's when I really started to excel, was when I was almost 24 years old, in the actual cardiopulmonary curriculum and paramedic curriculum. That's when I really started to excel. And by the time I got to graduate school, I was a great student. I was interested in the topics. I was motivated. But those first 4 years, it was just a slog. It was rough.
But and the other thing for me is like much as the 90s was an era of technological innovation. I mean, right now we are going through yet another
Oh yeah.
vastly incredible, the AI revolution. And so it seems, I mean, I don't know when you first heard about it, but I was on a call February last year, and
Mhm.
and my friend was showing me, it's like, oh, right, here, I'm going to type this in and we're going to write a sales letter. And then he
Yeah.
proceeded to drink tea and shared his screen on Zoom. And that was the first iteration. I think we were at ChatGPT 3 at that point. And
Yep. Yep.
obviously, the metaverse was still quite big, and yet that
Sure.
seems to have died. And this era of AI, and so I'm very curious around how to prepare my children best for this world, because it may shift and change. And I'm promoting more flexibility, adaptability. How do you act when the world is under such incredible change? And these might be more valuable skills than advanced mathematics, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But
Even in my entrepreneurial finance class today, I don't have my students doing calculations. I say, look, I want you learning why we're doing the calculations, but there's this great thing out there called software now, right? And it does a great job of it. And you're going to go to work at someone, and they're going to have their own software package. So, but I've said before, I don't think AI and the robots are going to take jobs. It's going to be the people who know how to leverage AI and the robots that are going to take the jobs, because it's still going to require people.
Yes. Yes.
And I think the more we can immerse our kids into the prompt engineering, the prompt generation, because it really is the quality of the questions that you ask, right? So critical thinking, really defining problems and problem solving, and allowing generative AI, and we'll be into predictive AI before long, where that'll become as prolific as generative AI, and we need to be preparing our kids to use that stuff.
I do agree that there will be work. I have read quotes from the Industrial Revolution where, again, they were fearing that all of the work would go away, and that clearly
Hmm.
has not happened.
For sure.
Uh, and I got to say, I'm excited for it, like in
I
terms
have
of
to.
where does this take human beings? Like, what are we capable of with these tools? And it's a very exciting time to be alive, in my personal judgment.
Yeah, I do quite a bit of work with health tech entrepreneurs, and when you get away from the medical device and even the clinical decision, there's starting to be some real clinical decision support tools that are using AI today that will take a little more of the regulatory path here with the federal Food and Drug Administration rather, but on some of the back end of healthcare, the claims management, the revenue cycle, the billing cycle, just the electronic medical records of being able to transcribe some of the conversations and filter out the banter, and I mean there's some really good things that are out there right now that are going to drastically improve productivity and solve some of the burnout problems that I think some of the providers have now.
I mean, we're definitely seeing burnout problems in our medical system over here. It's
Hmm.
been pretty difficult. So I imagine the States is the same. Is this,
Yeah.
you guys are having a lot of problems? Yeah. So it's not. I mean, my take on it is that it's just many people in the community are suffering, and it's just this continual exposure to difficulty after difficulty after
Yeah,
difficulty that in the end it's just like I'm not sure what I'm meant to do here.
for sure.
But hopefully the tools of AI in medicine to me can really help deal with some of the anxiety or fear of missing things, or hey, have you asked this critical question? If
Hmm.
it's following along, it's like, hey, you haven't asked whether they've coughed up blood.
Right.
And
Yeah.
like that if let's say tuberculosis was on the differential and that question hadn't been asked, then it could prompt me to do that. And I think that this
Right.
is we'll see a synergistic effects in medicine, and hopefully bring back passion for
Yeah.
medicine from the healthcare professionals, because that's the cost of this burnout
It
problem.
really, it
People are
really
just
is.
quitting. They're just like,
They are.
anything else but this.
Yeah.
But
And
I mean, health.
if they don't quit and leave, they quit and stay.
You're right. Yeah.
And both is bad, right?
Indeed. All right, Jeff. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you so much for today's podcast. I hope the listeners have got a lot of gems and wisdom out of our discussion. It's been a
Well, I
pleasure having
appreciate
you.
that. It's been an honor and a pleasure for me. And I would just tell your listeners, feel free to reach out to me. I'm very active on LinkedIn,
Yep.
or they can find me at jeffstandridge.com or innovationjunkie.com. Jeff S at innovationjunkie.com.
Jeff S at innovationjunkie.com. All right,
Mhm.
Jeff. Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much for today. And I wish you all the very best. Sounds like you've dialed in some really cool stuff. So I hope that keeps going. And thank you to everyone for joining us on the podcast. Look forward to seeing you next time. See you then.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us at the Visual Workplace. This is a notification that the information and ideas discussed here are general in nature and do not take into account your specific circumstances. You should seek specialist advice for any medical, financial, emotional, mental, or other difficulties that you are facing with appropriate specialists and professionals so that they can apply your specific circumstances and give you the required advice. Thank you for joining us, but this is also a notification that all information is indeed general in nature and not specific for your personal circumstances.